Alright guys, welcome back to another tutorial on building this Vue client application for authenticating a user and updating their details. Today we'll finish up the user details form by adding fields for the user to update their name, their personal website, and email address. In reality, I probably wouldn't just let a user change their email address without some serious email verification process, but since we're not updating that many details, let's just add it for illustrative purposes. We'll also make sure we can initialize the user details in the form based on the user's current up-to-date information from our database. So this is the state of our application. Last time we added the update user image picker, which allows us to sort of select an image here. And today we're going to add the text form fields to this form. So the first thing I want to do is to open up our details.vue component here. And I want to extract the user's current ID token. And we want to do that because to get the user's up-to-date details, we'll need to reach out to the me API route. And that route is authenticated and requires the token. But if we get to our details page, our user should be authenticated, so we can use our useAuth composable from our store to get their ID token. Let's import that right here towards the top of the script. So we'll import useAuth, and then inside of our setup, we will use that to get the ID token. That's it for getting their ID token. Now, before we end up making the request in this setup function or method, I want to create a sort of helper composable called useRequest that'll make requests a lot easier, as we're going to be making probably 4 or 5 requests in the next 2 tutorials. I want to add this inside of our utilities here under the util folder index.js. Now you could maybe make a new folder called composables, but as this is the last composable we'll be making, and it's closely related to this doRequest utility method we already created, because of that anyway, let's just add it here. Since this composable is going to make use of some of the Vue composition API features or hooks, let's import a ref and onMounted hook at the top of this file. Now let's go down and add our method. So this composable will be called useRequest. It will take request options, which are basically your Axios request options. And then it will take a second options field, and maybe I should call this use request options to distinguish it from this. And the only thing we're going to pass on this is an exec on mounted field. And so we want to extract that from the options. We're going to create some reactive properties, one that could store a potential error in data fetching, the other that will contain the successful data, and we want to manage a loading state as a Boolean. We're then going to create a function or method called exec, which will then execute this query, which was using Axios. So it's basically going to execute a doRequest call and forward on the request options. So let's scroll back down. So we're going to take the request data, and this request data actually will get merged with the request options that we passed to it. So this just allows us to add a field body like in a post request. So we're going to take our request options and merge the request options here with the request data passed to our exec function. And at first, we're going to clear out our data and error and set the loading state to true, which we can use in our UI. We're going to await a response from the doRequest utility method above, and then we'll set our data and error from this response and set our loading to false. Now, remember I set an exec on mounted field here that will be passed in the options, and that will be used to execute or call this exec immediately when a component is mounted if we wanted. So we'll say if exec on mounted, call the execute function. And we're actually going to use that, and we need to return all these fields in an object. You could, of course, return an array or something else, I think, but in this case, let's just return an object with exec, the error state, the data state, and the loading state. Let's now use this back in details.vue. And also, since we're going to have some loading state, let's import that UI loader we created earlier. So I'll just import the loader right here. Let's add the loader to our components. And we're getting an error because it's not used yet. And then let's make use of that composable we just created. So beneath the useauth, let's use request. And of course, we need to import use request. So maybe let's do it right here. And we'll call it use request. And we'll say from util. And that's it because it's an index.js file. So that should be enough. So now we have use request. And then we're going to extract the data and call it me data, the error and call it me error, and the loading state and call it me loading. Now we need to return these fields so that they are accessible in our template. So maybe just below where we call the use request, so below this closing parentheses, let's return those. So let's now make use of these fields and this loader up in our template here. For the user form, we will want to show it if we get that me data returned from our use request and if we're no longer in a loading state. Next, we're going to add the loader, and that will be shown if we have me loading, and I'll just give it a height of 256, and we're going to apply some Tailwind CSS to make it spin and to give it a color of blue and margin auto to sort of center it. And then I just want to display a little text in the case of an error with some red text here. So we'll say a paragraph that is text centered in red that says error fetching user if we get an error. We could also forward the actual message in that error if we wanted to, which maybe makes more sense since our API is providing an error, but so be it. The next thing I want to do is actually pass the me data or the user on the me data. So the data returned from the API has a user key or field. And so I want to pass that via props into this user form. So let's bind using :user, and we'll bind here the me data dot user. And if we had TypeScript, we'd know that there's a user field there. Of course, our user form does not yet know that we have a user, or maybe not so obvious, but it doesn't. So let's go and open this user form, which is in the UI folder. Actually, it's in the components folder here. So let's double click. And we have our user form, and let's define the props on it. Just below components, let's register some props. And then I'll auto format that. So we'll have a user prop, which is of type object. So now we'll be able to fetch the user at the API account me URL, which I didn't really show. Sorry, I skipped over that, with a GET request. And we'll make sure to provide the ID token here from useauth and extract its value in the bearer token format that you often see for authorization headers. So make sure you add that header. And then we're also going to execute this use request when the component mounts. So we don't need to call exec. You notice I'm not extracting exec here. We'll just execute it automatically inside of the use request composable. So let's go to our user form now and create some fields or user form fields based on this initial me data that is passed into the user form. So we're going to add some really tedious code here. So I apologize in advance. I'm going to go through it probably a little quickly. So I recommend you pause the video and that you check out the source code repository if you need some more time. Recall that we used Vee-Validate, a library for form validation, to validate our forms in the login form, and we'll do the same thing here with the user form. We'll use a use form hook to validate the entire form, and we'll use the use field composable or hook to validate individual fields. So let's add inside of a setup function here, which we don't have as of yet. We'll add the use form, and we'll add 3 separate use field composables. All right, that's an awful lot of code. And before doing anything, I also need to make sure to import use form and use field. So let's go up. And maybe right here, we'll say import use form and use field from Vee-Validate. Very good. And so this form meta field extracted from use form will tell us if the entire form is dirty or if the entire form is invalid. So that'll be used to sort of disable a button to submit the form if the entire form is not valid. And then we create 3 individual fields here. So the first use field that we're going to create is one called email. The second argument is an email validator. And just as a reminder, we created this validator and registered it in this validators.js file. So we have a sort of validator to make sure it's email and show that the field is required. And if it doesn't pass that validation, we return this message. Then we want to populate this with an initial value from props. So we defined our props here, but we do not yet have them in the setup function. But setup receives the props as the first argument. So we just enter props here, and that'll take care of that. So we want to initialize this field with those props. And then we also want to run our validation when the component mounts immediately. We're going to do the exact same thing for a name field, except we're going to take the user props. And right now, we do not yet have a validator for this, but we'll add it later. So we'll use null. And we'll do the same thing for our user's website. And we need to make sure to return all of these fields, the overall form metadata, some handlers for handling the email. The meta basically tells you if it's dirty, if it's valid. The value is used for binding the actual text of the input to our state. And then we're going to handle some changes and blurs. And we'll do that for each of these fields. So you can pause right here and copy all of these. Next, let's go ahead and use these in a template, which will also be pretty tedious. A lot of code will be added here. So just hang in there. That's how forms are a lot of the time. Okay, so I'm up in the user form. So let's add a whole bunch of template code for our form. Let's save and hope I copied the correct indentation and divs, but let's go to the top here. Okay, so immediately below the image cropper, I want to add an outer div with a max width of extra large with a little padding, and I want it to be centered, so we'll use margin auto. And then within this outer div, so we'll have divs with a Y or vertical margin of 1 using the Tailwind CSS class. So you can see this is one div and it ends here. And so each of the form fields will be wrapped in this div with margin Y1. So you have one here, and one here. So that will be for the email, name, and website. Within each of these divs, we'll have a label. So this one is for an email field. So we have an input with name, email here, and we'll give it a little label with some semi-bold font. This one is email address. This one has name. And if we scroll down, this one has a website URL. And for the inputs, these are going to be the same for each of our various fields. We're going to bind the value to the email value, which we returned from the script setup function. And if we have an input event, we're going to call the handle email change, which was provided by the use field composable. And on a blur event, we're going to call handle email blur. Then I've added some classes that just handle when this form is focused to give it a little outline so you know which field we're accessing. Beneath each of the inputs, I'm then going to add a wrapper div with a little height, and in that we're going to show any possible errors. So we're going to look at the email meta and also the valid field, and if there is an error, we want to display the email error message, which again was also returned from the template. And this actually should not be email meta. I want this to be email meta.touched. And so let's go to the paragraphs for all of these and make sure I'm using touched. I think I updated that later on. So we want name meta.touched and we want website meta.touched. So basically, I don't want the error occurred until they click in and out of the input box. Great. So let's just look at these. I do the exact same thing for a name field here. So you see a label of name. It's got a name title and the input is called name. I use the handlers and the value for the name that we return from the template. And then I show a name error message here if we are touched and the field is invalid. And we do the exact same thing. You can pause here for our website URL. So let's just go look at the current state of our application. All right, so here we are. So you can see that I had loaded the user's email properly. This user in the database does not yet have a name or a website URL. But let's just see if the name doesn't have any validation yet, and neither does the website URL. But let's maybe open our developer tools and just make sure that the value of the use field is being updated in the state. So let's go to the inspector. Let's open the user form. And if we scroll down, so these are the props that are passed, and you see there was no initial image URL or name or website. And let's see the metadata. So we don't actually want the meta, we actually want the field data. So, okay, here's the name value, Bob. So if I say like Bobby, you see that changed. And we should have that for the website value. You can see it has the fields here. And the email address, I guess these are in alphabetical order. The email value is bob@bob.com. Let's change it to comms. And it looks good. Let's maybe make it an invalid email address because we already have a validator set up for this. So let's just go bob@bob. Not a valid email address. That's working. So now we just need to add some validators for the name and website URL. As you might recall, we do that in this validators.js in our source folder. I already had it open. And so we define these rules. Let's define two more for name and URL. Here is the name rule, and it takes in the value, and we're just going to set a max name length limit to 60. Maybe there's like a Tongan name or Hawaiian name that's longer than that, but I know very few names that are over 60 characters. So if we pass that rule, we return true. Otherwise, we'll give a message that says the name may not exceed 60 characters. Then I will create a regex URL inside a URL rule. And so basically, we'll just create a regular expression that I found somewhere on Stack Overflow. And then we'll see if our value passes that or that the length is 0. So this is not a required field. But if the user does start to enter something, it must be a URL. So basically, this rule says it must be either empty or a URL. We can now apply these in our use field of the use form here. So let's go back to use form for name meta. And since we declared that validator globally, it's available as a string, so we can call this name. And then we should be able to go to here and call this URL. Let's actually give this a try in the browser. So maybe let's enter a name, hopefully longer than 60. Looks like I need to do a refresh for the validators to register. So let's now try these rules out in the browser. So remember that the field must be touched. So I was entering a long string here before for the name, but you can see that it must not exceed 60 characters. And I did touch this field already. So if I restart this, for example, and then if I do something that's obviously 60 characters, you won't get the error until I click website URL. All right. And then if I just type a URL, let's just say HTTP and then go away, you see that it must be a valid URL. So let's say, my web page. For some reason, Bob owns my web page. There we go. And then let's get rid of some of these characters, and the name is valid. And there it is working. Next, I want to create some events inside of this form that will submit the form details or a newly cropped image, which we created last time, up to the parent details component. And next time we'll manage a lot of the logic or interaction with the API inside of the parent of this update users. So to define the events that are emitted, you can create an emits field inside of the root view component here. And that needs to be a colon. And the two fields or events that I want to be able to emit, I want to call details submitted and image submitted. So these will be the two that our component emits. Then I want to create a method called submit details. which will be wrapped by the use form. Remember, we have this use form handle submit. So I want to create a method for submitting our details, and we'll wrap it in this handle submit. And what this does is it extracts all of the individual fields on the form and just make sure we can't call the function unless our form is valid. So let's go maybe just below all these and add a submit details. And we need access to emit, but we're going to emit a detail submitted event, which we just defined. And we're going to do it actually not with email and password. We're going to do it with email, yes, but we're going to have a name and we're going to have a website. Good. So we'll say this is form values dot name, and these are given basically on what the input fields are called. Actually, they're defined based on what this first parameter of each use field is called. Let me correct myself there. So then we'll say form values dot website. And then this emit, if you recall, comes from the second parameter of our setup function. So we'll extract that using destructuring with emit, and actually it's emit. Very good. And we're also going to emit this event called image submitted directly in our template. So we're basically going to forward the image cropped event from image cropper to the image submitted event in this user form. Before I do that, I notice that in the image cropper, I accidentally defined this key as events, but it should actually be called emit image cropped. I think the template would have still worked, but this is the proper naming. So inside of user form, let's go up to where that image cropper is, and let's then create an @image_cropped event. Now that's the event fired inside of this component. And when that happens, we're going to fire or emit image submitted with the payload. So we're basically going to forward the payload of the image cropper event to the image cropped, or sorry, to the image submitted event. And that is, remember, image submitted, we defined right here in our emits. Let's save. Finally, I want to create a button that is disabled if our form is not valid, but this button will be used to call this submit details, and it will be disabled again if our form isn't valid. So let's go up into our template again and see, where did I define this? Probably below this H6 or even this MY1 here. Yeah, so probably just below this. So many divs. All right. And this button also needs to have a closing div at the bottom, I think. Very good. And so this is just a div with some top margin, and then we'll put a sort of centered button in the middle with margin auto, MX auto. And this button will be disabled if the overall form state is invalid or is not valid, or if it's not dirty. So basically, I want to make sure the user has actually tried to change something before the form is submittable. And you could do a complete validation to make sure that the initial state does not match the final state, but I'm just going to keep it simple for our use case. So let's open the browser now and see what we have. Let's keep the Vue DevTools open here. And I want to open the timeline, which will allow us to see what events get fired. So let's maybe select a new image. Next time we'll show the current image. All right, so let's do that. And now if I click crop image, and maybe I'll change this to update image in the next tutorial, but hopefully we see some events fired. And what you see is the image cropped was fired from the image cropper, and that was kind of relayed to the image submit event in the user form we worked on today. And so we'll be able to access the actual file we crop in the details component next time. Let's see if we can update this. So right now I haven't changed anything, but maybe let's add a name. And you see now that we have a name, I've done some sort of change. Our form is valid, so I can update. So let's maybe just add bob.me. We have a valid URL, and let's update and hopefully see an event. So I'm seeing the click events here, but I'm not seeing the component event. So let's see what's wrong. So our button seems to be working. We have the @click submit details. And that should fire a details submitted. So let's make sure that's correct. I'm not returning the submit details from the template. So it's not, this submit details is not accessible in our template unless we return it. So good reminder. Let's save. Let's go back and let's add a name. Bob.me. Let's update and hopefully see an event. There's a little green bubble here. And you can see that our event detail submitted was sent and that we have the payload email, name, and website. All right, guys, thanks for sticking around again. Next time, we should tie everything together and we'll reach out to our API to update the user's image. We'll be able to delete their image. We'll be able to update their main details here, and we will be able to sign out of the application. Anyway, hasta pronto, que se cuiden.